In the final hour of Adolf Hitler's life, the world above was collapsing, and the world below had already gone quiet. The Führerbunker, buried beneath the ruins of the Reich Chancellery in central Berlin, was a concrete tomb, 15 feet thick, windowless, stale with recycled air, and vibrating softly with the distant thud of Soviet artillery. The walls were gray, the lamps flickered, the floor was damp. At 3 p.m. on April 30th, 1945, inside this fortress of reinforced hopelessness, a small cluster of loyalists and frightened staff clung to fading protocols, still saluting, still whispering Mein Führer, still pretending that the war hadn't already been lost in a dozen different ways. Outside, Soviet troops were within 300 meters of the entrance. But no one dared speak of surrender. No one dared speak above a murmur. Hitler had made it clear he would not be captured, he would not be paraded, and he would not die at the hands of the enemy. His world, the 1,000-year Reich, had lasted only 12. But in this final hour, he was still trying to control how it ended. His hands were trembling, his face pale and sunken. His mustache had thinned, and his voice, once fiery, now hoarse, cracked when he spoke. The man who had once commanded millions now struggled to shuffle between rooms, supported by his mistress Eva Braun and his valet Heinz Linge. Every step felt like a ritual. Every breath felt borrowed. Outside his quarters, the corridors were lined with aides who didn't know whether to prepare for death, escape, or simply continue existing as if time still mattered. The bunker was a paradox, both prison and throne room, filled with silence, fear, and the illusion of control. Hitler had spent the morning pacing, dictating his last will and political testament to his secretary, Traudl Junge. His voice, hollow and exacting, echoed against the concrete walls. He spoke of betrayal, Göring, Himmler, the SS, the generals, naming enemies among his own, rewriting the collapse as sabotage rather than failure. In this version, Germany didn't lose. It had been stabbed in the back again, just like in 1918. He never once mentioned the death camps. He never once acknowledged the millions. Instead, he repeated the myth of his own necessity. "I alone bear responsibility," he said, but it wasn't contrition. It was ownership, a final stamp of authorship on a world in flames. Meanwhile, in the bunker kitchen, Eva Braun's champagne was being chilled. Even as the building above smoldered, she was smiling. Her dream, grotesque and surreal, had come true. She would die beside him, not as a mistress, but as a wife. Hours earlier, at 1 a.m., the two had been married in a brief civil ceremony in the map room, overseen by a low-level Nazi official too nervous to look them in the eye. They drank cheap sekt, they ate cake. And then they returned to their rooms, not as newlyweds, but as ghosts rehearsing their own funeral. No music, no celebration, just the sound of water dripping from pipes and the occasional bark of Blondie, Hitler's beloved German shepherd, still pacing loyally nearby. But even Blondie wouldn't survive the day. Hitler had already ordered her death, a test for the cyanide capsules he would soon bite down on himself. His personal doctor, Werner Hasse, had prepared them. Potassium cyanide, odorless, fast, irreversible. By afternoon, Hitler had insisted on trying one on Blondie. She died within seconds, foaming at the mouth. Hitler said nothing, but his jaw clenched and he turned away. Later, he would retreat to his study with Eva, closing the doors behind him. She carried a small pistol, a gift from her brother. He carried his own Walter PPK, but cyanide would come first. The gun was insurance. No one outside the room knew exactly what time it happened, maybe 3:30 p.m., maybe 3:40. There was no announcement, just a muffled pop. And then stillness. Heinz Linge waited. So did Otto Günsche, his SS adjutant. When they opened the door, the smell of almonds, cyanide, lingered in the air. Hitler sat slumped on the sofa. Eva beside him. Blood soaked the right side of Hitler's face. A clean shot to the temple, the pistol still in his hand. Eva looked peaceful, untouched, just a faint stain of blue on her lips. No final words, no last gaze, just silence, just death. The man who once screamed across stadiums died in a whisper, and in that moment, in that narrow, low-ceilinged bunker beneath a dying city, a chapter of world history ended not with justice or vengeance or truth, but with two bodies on a sofa and two men dragging their corpses into the hallway. Rags were wrapped around the heads, a blanket thrown over them. Outside, in the courtyard, bombs still fell. And the final instructions were followed. Gasoline poured over the bodies, a match struck. The flames rose, and the fire, Hitler's last command, tried to erase him. As the bodies burned in the courtyard above, the atmosphere inside the Führer bunker shifted, not with relief, but with a strange, paralyzing hollowness. For those who remained, Hitler's death was not liberation. It was a vacuum. The room had lost its center of gravity, and no one knew what rules still applied. The bunker, once rigid with rituals and routines, morning briefings, clipped salutes, a constant parade of maps and commands, now drifted into a quiet chaos. There was no announcement, no formal declaration of death, just whispers, unspoken understanding. A glance from Heinz Linge was all it took. The Führer was dead, and yet, for the next several hours, the people underground moved carefully, mechanically, as if Hitler might still emerge from his study and demand to know why no one had fetched his tea. In the tight hallways, boots still clicked, secretaries still typed, aides still rehearsed the old behaviors, not out of loyalty, but out of inertia. For so long, every breath had been about pleasing him. Now there was no one to please. Just the ticking clock, just the war ending one explosion at a time above their heads. And for many of them, just the question: what happens to us now? Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's loyal propaganda minister, took command in name only. He was now Reich Chancellor, by Hitler's final political testament. But it was a title drenched in irony. The Reich was already in rubble, and Goebbels knew it. His wife, Magda, moved like a ghost through the halls. She wore pearls. She comforted her children. But inside her was a furnace of madness. She had already decided the children would not survive the new Germany. They belonged to Hitler's world. If that world was gone, so were they. Upstairs, their 6 children, blonde, pale, wide-eyed, played with dolls and puzzle pieces in the upper bunker, unaware that their fate had already been sealed by the ideology that raised them. Magda would later write, "They are too good for the world that will come." She wasn't alone in that logic. The bunker was now filled with men and women who believed the world beyond the walls was unfit to inherit the Reich. Some spoke of escape, others of suicide, some both. Himmler was already gone, having tried to negotiate peace behind Hitler's back. Göring had fled to the Alps. Hitler's inner circle, once defined by blood oaths and fanatic devotion, was scattering like dry leaves. And yet inside the bunker, something kept them frozen. Fear. Not just of the Soviets, not just of retribution, but of being remembered. History, they knew, was coming for them, and there was no way to outrun it. In the communications room, General Hans Krebs sat surrounded by outdated wires and silent radios. He drank cognac by the bottle, trying to drown the weight of what he knew. The last communication from the German High Command had arrived hours ago. No reinforcements, no escape plan. Just the silence of a military machine that had already accepted its collapse. Krebs had spent years lying for Hitler. He had rewritten defeats as strategic repositioning. Now he was tasked with the ultimate lie. Pretending command still existed. He scribbled fake orders. He fabricated reports of phantom divisions. He sent messages into the void. It was theater. It was denial. And he knew it. But the alternative, admitting defeat, felt worse than death. For many in the bunker, the collapse of the Reich wasn't just political. It was existential. They had built their lives, their marriages, their beliefs around Hitler's vision. They had tattooed swastikas into their dreams. They had sworn oaths, executed prisoners, denounced neighbors, all under the promise of national rebirth. Now, with Berlin in ruins, those same people were left with the ashes of a delusion, and the question none of them would say aloud: who are we without him? In the hallways, SS guards stood at attention with no orders to follow. Some wept, others muttered prayers. A few stared blankly at the cracked concrete, counting the seconds until the Soviets breached the walls. They had been taught to fear communists like devils, rapists, torturers, monsters. Whether or not it was true didn't matter. The fear had grown roots, and the men with guns knew what they had done in Russia. They expected revenge. The Führer bunker had always been filled with paranoia, but now it became suffocating. Every cough sounded like betrayal. Every movement was watched. People whispered in corners. They made promises. They planned quiet exits. Meanwhile, the structure itself was deteriorating. The smell of smoke from the courtyard seeped into the vents. Water leaked from overhead pipes. The floors shook with every nearby explosion, and the power flickered, forcing staff to write by candlelight. As if the modern empire they had claimed would last 1,000 years had already returned to the medieval dark. One floor above, near the Chancellery Garden, the charred remains of Hitler and Eva Braun were still smoldering. SS men kept watch, guarding the fire like a relic. But the flames didn't cleanse, they didn't purify. They just reminded everyone that the end wasn't coming. It had already arrived. And still, deep underground, the people who had followed him to the gates of hell waited. For death, for orders, for meaning. But none of those things would come. Only silence, only memory, and soon, only history. As the minutes passed and Hitler's absence stretched into permanence, something darker began to settle over the bunker. Not just grief or fear, but a kind of ideological vertigo. Without the man who had defined their reality, many of Hitler's most loyal followers were now staring into an abyss of meaninglessness. The world they had believed in, built on supremacy, myth, destiny, had shattered, and yet their bodies still moved. Their routines persisted, as if habit alone might protect them from collapse. In the underground corridors, uniforms still mattered. Salutes were still offered. Orders, even meaningless ones, were still issued and obeyed. But the conviction behind those rituals had evaporated. They were pantomimes now, hollow repetitions of a vanished faith. The silence that followed Hitler's suicide was not immediate chaos. It was something stranger. A dull, ritualistic continuation of a system already dead. His aides sealed the room. His staff burned his documents. And Goebbels, who had spent 12 years shaping Hitler's myth, now found himself the guardian of that myth's corpse. But even as he took charge, he knew the truth. There was nothing left to protect. He stood in Hitler's study, staring at the sofa where the blood had dried, and he said nothing. Magda stood beside him, pale and cold. She wasn't thinking about history. She was thinking about the children upstairs, the sleeping daughters, the quiet sons, and she was already preparing to end their lives. But she did it with a terrifying calm, as if it were the last loyal act she could offer her Führer. Goebbels himself, always dramatic, always self-mythologizing, was beginning to draft his own ending. But first he would oversee the final hours of the bunker like a conductor directing the last notes of a requiem. Around them, the bunker's staff entered survival mode. Some tried to flee, others packed letters. A few wept silently into uniforms they no longer believed in. Hitler's personal cook, Constanze Manziarli, still prepared small meals no one would eat. Rochus Misch, the telephone operator, kept the lines open even though no one was calling. Secretaries typed out final records, and the Nazi leadership, such as it was, stared blankly at maps showing divisions that no longer existed. Berlin was lost. The Soviet army was crushing resistance block by block, apartment by apartment. The red banner had already been raised over the Reichstag. And in the surrounding streets, German civilians were being pulled from basements, prisoners freed, soldiers executed. The end was not coming. It was consuming. And deep below it all, the last believers were trying to decide whether to vanish, to run, or to die in the same myth they had helped create. In one of the inner rooms, Ludwig Stumpfegger, Hitler's personal physician, was preparing cyanide capsules. He moved like a man condemned, checking and rechecking the dose. He had been present when Blondie, Hitler's beloved dog, had been killed as a test. He had seen the way Hitler's hand trembled as the dog convulsed on the floor. Now, he was repeating that moment again and again, handing death into the hands of secretaries, valets, and generals who no longer trusted one another but couldn't imagine disobedience. The capsule was the currency of the hour. Everyone knew what it meant when you were handed one. The room with the children, the Goebbels children, had grown quieter. Magda, dressed impeccably, had already asked the SS for help. She needed assistance, not with hiding the children, but with ending their lives. She'd already written letters to her older son from a previous marriage, explaining her choice. "Our splendid idea is ruined," she had written. "And with it goes everything beautiful, admirable, noble, and good that I have known in my life." She believed the new world, the post-Nazi world, was not worth giving her children to. Better to send them away now while they were still pure. That word, pure, was always the lie that made evil possible. She prepared sedatives. She dressed them in clean clothes. She whispered to them that everything would be fine. And one by one, with help from Stumpfegger, she fed them the poison. One by one, the children of Nazi Germany were silenced by the people who had raised them. No cries were heard, only silence, only stillness. Upstairs, guards wept. One reportedly fainted. Another fled the bunker entirely. Magda remained calm, her husband beside her. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She had convinced herself, perhaps long before, that this was mercy, that she was saving them from a world that wouldn't understand them, a world where the Reich had failed. But no child ever asked to be part of that failure, and no mother had the right to make that choice. In that moment, the ideology of Nazism showed its true face, not just in death, but in its utter rejection of life itself. By evening, Hitler's body was ash. His legacy was broken. But in the bunker, the ritual of self-destruction continued. It was no longer about ideology or loyalty. It was momentum, a slow, spiraling descent of people who couldn't imagine a world without the thing they had once worshipped. Even as the Soviets reached the Chancellery steps, many remained underground. Some planned escape routes through subway tunnels. Others simply sat with their capsules, waiting for the moment they would be brave enough to swallow them. There were no speeches, no last-minute bravery, just a quiet unraveling, a room of believers, each now alone with the truth. That everything they had fought for was not only gone, it had never been real to begin with. By the time darkness fell over Berlin on April 30th, 1945, the city was no longer a capital. It was a carcass. And beneath its splintered bones, the Führerbunker had become something worse than a shelter. It was a reliquary for the dead, both literal and ideological. The silence was broken only by the tremors of nearby shell fire and the occasional creak of pipes overhead. No one in the bunker pretended anymore. Hitler was gone. The Goebbels children were gone. And within hours, Josef and Magda would be gone too. All that remained was the question of what death should look like when the world you built is burning above you. There were no orders anymore, only customs. The people still alive in the bunker clung to routines like shipwreck survivors clinging to driftwood, cleaning boots, tidying beds, checking the map of a front that no longer existed. But behind every motion was dread. They all knew they were surrounded. The Soviets had pierced through the Tiergarten. Snipers were stationed atop the Reichstag. Flamethrowers were being used to clear out resistance from the tunnels. And the Red Army had already discovered the entrance to the Chancellery Garden, the same place where Hitler's scorched remains now lay buried in a shallow, gas-soaked crater. Still, some inside the bunker hoped for a miracle. Escape plans flickered like fading candlelight. A few officers believed they could still break through Soviet lines by nightfall, disappearing into the ruins of the city with forged papers and a story that erased who they had once been. Others spoke of surrender, not loudly, but with the hushed guilt of heresy. Surrender meant facing what they had done. Surrender meant giving themselves over to those they had called monsters. It meant justice, or something worse. For many, death seemed simpler. Death required no explanation, no confession, no reckoning. It just closed the door. The last major figures in the bunker were already choosing their exits. Joseph Goebbels, once Hitler's golden voice, the master manipulator of German propaganda, had turned pale with purpose. He had decided on death not with despair, but with theatrical resolve. His loyalty was total, his ego unshakable. If the Reich could not live, then neither could he. But he would go on his terms. That night, he and Magda walked into the open courtyard for the last time. Their 6 children were already buried beneath them. The cyanide had done its work. Their small, lifeless bodies were wrapped in blankets and tucked into the shallow grave that had once been a bunker garden. Joseph and Magda stood together, holding hands, as an SS officer readied the pistol. Magda insisted on being shot in the heart. Joseph followed. No ceremony, no last words, just two bodies beside their children, another fire, another grave. Their deaths, like Hitler's, were supposed to be symbolic. But in truth, they were just more casualties of a myth that had consumed its own believers. Inside, the remaining staff began to dissolve. Some cried, some gathered their few belongings, others wandered, dazed, into side corridors, unsure of whether to hide, run, or wait for someone to make a decision that would never come. The bunker had no oxygen of command left. It was a shell, a sealed, suffocating echo chamber filled with uniforms, secrets, and a terrible collective awareness. It was over. But for those last few hours, everyone moved with the slow, fearful awareness that history was sharpening its pen above their heads. They wondered who would be remembered, who would be blamed, who would be forgotten. Hitler's personal staff, secretaries like Traudl Junge, Gerda Christian, and Elsa Kruger, gathered quietly in one room, waiting. They were among the few who had not yet decided whether to live or die. The capsules were in their pockets, but so was hope, fragile, flickering, irrational. In the silence, they whispered what-ifs. What if the Soviets weren't monsters? What if they were captured but spared? What if survival didn't mean betrayal? Some cried quietly. Others wrote farewell letters, not knowing whether they would ever be delivered. Junge, who had typed Hitler's last testament, felt the weight of having recorded the final delusions of a dying man. She later wrote that she felt both shame and numbness, as if her hands had been borrowed by history without her consent. The SS guards, once symbols of absolute power, now appeared broken and hollow. Some wandered into the upper corridors, clutching pistols but unable to choose the moment. Others sat down in corners and simply waited for a bullet, for a fire, for the knock of Soviet boots on the steel doors. One officer, overcome by guilt or fear, shot himself outside the communications room. Another handed out chocolate and cigarettes, offering smiles that didn't reach his eyes. There was no order to the unraveling. No one had planned for this part. Outside, in the world above, Berlin burned. Thousands of German soldiers had already surrendered. The Volkssturm, teenage boys and elderly men handed rifles in the final weeks, had been wiped out. Civilians were flooding basements and tunnels, pleading for mercy or praying for a quick end. And from the Reichstag rooftop, Soviet soldiers were raising their flag, not for vengeance, but for victory. In the bunker, however, the concept of victory had vanished. There was no resistance, only residue. The remains of a machine that had consumed millions and now had nothing left to devour but itself. The radio fell silent. The last reports were fiction. There were no reinforcements, no loyal divisions, no Alpine redoubt, no miracle weapon. The myths had collapsed, the lies had run out, and all that remained was the grinding, final truth. This was how it ends. Not in glory, not in loyalty, not even in flames, just in cold silence, steel walls and the smell of death drifting through recycled air. When Soviet troops finally reached the ruins of the Reich Chancellery on May 1st, the war was technically not yet over, but the outcome had been carved into the bricks of Berlin days earlier. The building was a hollowed shell, its grand corridors twisted by fire, its banners ripped and burned, its marbles stained with ash and blood. The courtyard smelled of gasoline and charred bones. Flames still flickered beneath a thin layer of soot. What the Red Army found was not a fortress, but a mausoleum. Above ground, the last physical symbols of the Nazi regime crumbled in silence. But the Soviets were not here for symbolism. They were here for proof, for a corpse, for confirmation that the man responsible for one of history's most grotesque wars was finally, unquestionably, dead. Stalin had demanded it, not rumor, not whispers, but a body. And yet, what they would find, or fail to find, would only deepen the mystery. Beneath the chancellery, the entrances to the bunker were choked with debris, half-collapsed walls, and wreckage that testified to the desperate final defense of Berlin. It took hours for Soviet troops to locate and secure the passages that led underground. What greeted them was eerie. The bunker had been mostly abandoned in haste, but not in panic. Beds were made, dishes left in neat stacks, papers scattered but not shredded. It was as if the inhabitants had simply walked out of their lives and into nothingness. In Hitler's private study, they found an empty sofa with bloodstains on the armrest and carpet, a pistol on the floor, a faint scent of smoke, but no body, just fragments, bone, a jaw, a partial skull, remnants of teeth. The rest, if there had been more, had been consumed by fire. The Soviets recovered what they could and removed the remains under strict secrecy. No announcements were made. No photographs were released. The world would not know, not yet. Stalin, obsessed with control and suspicion, ordered the entire matter classified. Even top Soviet generals were kept in the dark. The uncertainty became a weapon. Was Hitler dead? Had he escaped? Had he fled to Argentina or Spain or even to a hidden redoubt in the Bavarian Alps? The conspiracy theories didn't start decades later. They began that very week. Soviet silence became fertile ground for Western paranoia. American and British intelligence officers began intercepting rumors and whispers across Europe. A man resembling Hitler had been spotted on a train in Denmark. Another sighting placed him in a U-boat near Norway. Theories multiplied. With no clear evidence and the Nazis' mastery of misdirection, many were willing to believe that the man who had upended the 20th century might have slipped through the cracks, and for a while, it suited everyone. The Americans could use the uncertainty to interrogate captured Nazis. The Soviets could use it to justify their occupation and expansion. The myth of Hitler alive became more valuable than any confession. Meanwhile, in the heart of Moscow, dental records brought from Berlin were matched with fragments of a burned jaw. Soviet agents had interrogated Hitler's personal dentist's assistant Käthe Häusermann and dental technician Fritz Echtmann. Both confirmed the fillings, bridges, and gold work. It was him, no doubt. But Stalin refused to release that information publicly. He understood power. And he knew that sometimes a dead man's shadow could be more useful than the truth of his grave. So the Soviet Union let the myth linger. Even President Truman, when asked directly by a reporter in 1945 whether Hitler was dead, responded, "We have been told he is, but I wouldn't bet my life on it." And so the world kept watching, waiting, wondering. The mystery of Hitler's death was not born from absence, but from strategy, deliberate silence, calculated ambiguity. The truth, scorched and buried beneath rubble, was treated as state property. It would remain that way for decades. Meanwhile, in Germany, Allied forces began uncovering the full extent of Nazi atrocities. The liberation of concentration camps, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald, Mauthausen, painted a horror far beyond anything most civilians had imagined. The images, the testimony, the corpses, stacked like lumber, starved, frozen, desecrated, became the moral indictment that Hitler's charred remains could never satisfy. The world didn't need to see his body. It needed to see what he had built and what it had done. Yet even then, there were those who preferred not to look, who preferred the mystery. The idea that the man had somehow escaped was, perversely, more comforting than confronting what he had left behind. A living monster could still be hunted, but a dead one left only questions. In the years that followed, the myth of Hitler's final hour became a canvas. Fiction, documentaries, books, even government reports competed to fill in the missing pieces. Who identified the bodies? Who gave the order to burn them? Why was there no photo? Could it really have happened the way the survivors claimed? And underneath all of it, the haunting question: how could a man responsible for the deaths of tens of millions vanish into ash in a backyard fire pit and leave behind so little? The truth was simple, but simplicity rarely satisfies history. He died in a bunker, in silence, surrounded not by an empire but by decay. He bit a capsule, he pulled a trigger, his body was burned and buried, and the world turned. Forever changed, never fully healed. But we want more than that. We want justice, a reckoning, a scene. We want to watch evil die. And when we are denied that, we keep digging into theories, into graves, into shadows that stretch longer the more we chase them. The last hour in Hitler's bunker did not give the world closure. It gave it silence. And from that silence came everything else. For those who survived the bunker, the world they emerged into wasn't a victory. It was a vacuum. The end of Hitler had not come with a grand climax, but with a whisper. No radio speech, no final declaration, no trial, no verdict. Just the scorched bones of a man who once claimed he would reign for 1,000 years. And yet, that absence, that lack of theatricality, made the aftermath even more disorienting. Traudl Junge, who had typed Hitler's last will, walked through the bombed-out streets of Berlin as a ghost in her own body. She had served the most dangerous man in modern history, and yet couldn't fully comprehend what that meant. Not yet. Her eyes scanned the rubble-strewn streets as Soviet patrols passed. No one looked at her. No one knew her name. She was alive, but she no longer knew why. Other survivors from the bunker were less fortunate. SS men who had fled through the ruins were captured, interrogated, and sometimes executed on sight. The Soviets had no interest in mercy. They had seen what the Nazis had done in Leningrad, in Stalingrad, in every village and trench from the Volga to the Vistula. For them, the hunt wasn't about justice, it was about vengeance. And if a survivor from the bunker could be made to talk, to confess, to name names, to reconstruct that final hour, they were kept alive, but barely. A few tried to lie, said Hitler escaped, said he fled in disguise, but the Soviets had the dental records, the witnesses, the timelines. They let the rumors live publicly, but behind closed doors they knew. Still, the mythology only deepened. In Argentina, in Chile, in the mountains of Austria, stories bloomed. Men claimed to have seen him in taverns, in churches, at the edge of a forest. A fisherman swore he spotted him boarding a U-boat. A priest said he'd given him communion. These tales weren't harmless curiosities. They were projections. The human need to personify evil, to keep it tangible. Because if Hitler was still alive, we could keep hunting him. We wouldn't have to face what it meant that he died so quietly, so easily, that the monster of the century had ended himself in a concrete box, leaving his empire to rot in silence. The Allies, meanwhile, had bigger problems. Germany was in ruins, millions displaced, infrastructure decimated. The camps had been liberated, but now came the reckoning. Nuremberg, the trials, the archives, the witness testimony, the photographs, the films. A mountain of evidence began to form, rising higher than any story of bunker intrigue. But the mystery of Hitler's final hour, what really happened down there, remained a footnote too important to forget. It hovered like a shadow above the trials. Yes, the war criminals sat in the dock. Yes, the architects of genocide answered for their crimes. But the man who started it all was missing, gone, burned. Ashes somewhere in the Soviet zone. Not even a grave. The Americans didn't trust it. Neither did the British. Stalin played games. He allowed the rumor to fester. At one point, he even told President Truman that he believed Hitler was hiding in Spain. It wasn't true, but it kept everyone on edge. It kept the ghost alive. For decades, Western intelligence agencies quietly searched for signs. Files were opened, closed, reopened. Nazi hunters like Simon Wiesenthal compiled testimonies from people who claimed to have seen the Führer alive. In 1946, in 1953, even as late as the 1970s. But every lead unraveled. Every alleged sighting turned out to be fantasy, delusion, or deliberate hoax. The world was chasing smoke. Still, no photos of the body were ever released. No public funeral. No definitive, official Western announcement from Stalin. And in that vacuum, a story grew. Some believed Hitler had created body doubles, that a man had died in his place, that the SS had staged the suicide to buy time for his escape. Others claimed a secret airfield had been built near the bunker, that a plane had taken off into the night, carrying him toward South America. Others pointed to Vatican passports, secret submarine routes, Nazi gold trails through Spain. It was fiction, mostly. But not all of it was absurd. The Nazis did plan escape routes. Many high-ranking officers did vanish into sympathetic countries. Operation Paperclip brought Nazi scientists to the US under new names. Others ended up in Argentina, where towns like Bariloche became havens for former SS. So the idea that Hitler had escaped, while untrue, existed within a world where escape had indeed been possible for some. And that's what kept the questions alive. Not because we didn't know the truth, but because the truth felt inadequate. How could the man responsible for the greatest horrors of modern history be gone so quickly, so quietly? No trial. No last words, no public shame, just cyanide, just a bullet, just flame. And yet, that's how he wanted it. Hitler never intended to be judged. He feared humiliation more than death. He knew what Mussolini's corpse had endured. Beaten, hanged upside down, spit on by the same people who once cheered him. He would not allow that ending. His final hour was carefully staged, even as the walls collapsed. He gave orders. He wrote a will. He posed for his secretaries. He chose his own curtain. And then he stepped behind it. He did not want to face the world he destroyed. He wanted to vanish from it. Not as a man, but as an idea. An idea that would remain, to haunt, to confuse, to poison. That was his final gift to history. Not a grave, a question. The mystery Hitler left behind didn't just haunt his enemies, it infected the very foundations of the post-war world. Across continents, in offices filled with cigarette smoke and surveillance files, intelligence officers began stitching together timelines, maps, witness accounts, fragments. But what they found was less about Hitler himself and more about what he had created. A system so vast, so fanatically loyal, that it continued moving even after its leader had turned to ash. The SS had contingency plans, the Gestapo had relocation routes, the Nazi Party had assets smuggled across oceans in crates of artwork, stolen currency, and gold fillings wrenched from the teeth of murdered Jews. Hitler's suicide didn't end the Reich's reach, it scattered it into South American neighborhoods, into remote European monasteries, into scientific laboratories in the United States and the Soviet Union. Operation Paperclip, the US program to recruit German scientists, brought former Nazis into NASA, into missile programs, into Cold War machinery. In the East, Stalin absorbed others into the KGB, the Red Army, Soviet rocket factories. The very people who had helped design weapons for the Third Reich were now building the future of two superpowers, and beneath it all was that silent absence, the bunker. No dictator trial, no corpse on display, no televised reckoning. Just a world trying to rebuild while wondering how evil could exit so cleanly. And as decades passed, that silence hardened into narrative. In West Germany, the new republic emerged scarred and fragile, its first generation burdened by the sins of their fathers and the bodies beneath their cities. East Germany, under Soviet control, rewrote the story entirely. They blamed the Nazis' rise on Western capitalism and claimed to be the true anti-fascist state. Meanwhile, Argentina became a hotbed of suspicion. Former Nazi officers were arrested. Others simply changed their names and opened bakeries, car dealerships, political consulting firms. The idea that Hitler might have joined them was ridiculous, and yet almost logical in a world where Adolf Eichmann was found living under his own name just miles from German expats sipping coffee in Buenos Aires. What made it worse was the Soviet silence. Every piece of evidence regarding Hitler's remains, the jawbone, the dental fragments, the bloodied upholstery, was locked in secret archives. It wasn't until 1968, more than 2 decades later, that the Kremlin quietly published a report confirming the forensic match. But by then, the world had moved on, and the doubt had rooted itself too deeply. Films, books, documentaries, even official government memorandums began to toy with the question, what if he escaped? But behind that question was a deeper, more terrifying one. What if he didn't need to escape at all? What if the ideology itself survived him? What if the men in suits, the ones who now ran intelligence agencies, diplomatic missions, and scientific institutions, had carried part of the Reich with them, not as belief, but as method? Because the truth was, many had. The intelligence techniques the CIA used in the Cold War, surveillance, psychological profiling, blackmail, came in part from files seized from the Gestapo. Soviet gulags mirrored the same bureaucratic cruelty that had made Nazi death camps so ruthlessly efficient. And while Western Europe spoke of democracy, it tolerated men who had helped design the machinery of the Holocaust, as long as they switched allegiances. And so, in a way, Hitler had won something he never planned for. He infected the world not with survival, but with compromise. He didn't have to live on. His legacy metastasized without him. And still, that bunker held its power. It became a symbol of control, of collapse, of cowardice. Tourists in Berlin asked where it was, but the German government refused to mark it. They didn't want a shrine. They didn't want to give conspiracy theorists a place to stand. So for years, it remained buried beneath a parking lot. No plaque, no monument, just pavement above the spot where the most dangerous man in modern history took his own life and left a continent in ruins. But the stories continued. In 2009, a Russian television broadcast claimed Hitler had lived until the 1960s. In 2014, declassified FBI documents, already known but now online, showed how obsessed US agents were with tips, no matter how absurd. Even National Geographic aired specials asking, "Did Hitler escape?" And the audience kept watching, because the lie felt better than the truth. The truth that a failed artist from Austria could rise to total power, launch a war that killed 70 million, orchestrate genocide, and then kill himself like a frightened animal. Underground felt anticlimactic, unsatisfying, unjust. So the myth survived, not just because it was dramatic, but because it helped us delay the harder question: how did we let this happen? How did a civilized world produce a man like Hitler? And not just produce him, follow him, adore him, defend him, die for him. That is the deeper mystery, the one no bunker diagram or dental record can answer, the one that still echoes in today's headlines. Because if Hitler was a monster, then we're safe. Monsters are rare. But if he was human, if he was ordinary, then the next one is already possible. Maybe already among us. That's the real horror. Not that he escaped, but that he didn't need to. Because parts of him never left. The psychological autopsy of Adolf Hitler began not with medical files or forensic remains, but with questions whispered by the world. How does a man become what he became? And how does such a man vanish into flame without ever fully being understood? The bunker left no answers, only silence, myths, and smudged fingerprints on the walls of history. But in the decades that followed, scholars, psychiatrists, and survivors all tried to dissect the mind that engineered a war, a genocide, and a legacy of ruin. The Americans had already begun the work in 1943. The OSS, precursor to the CIA, commissioned a psychological profile of Hitler even before his death, based on speeches, patterns, rumors, and interviews with those who had met him. The report, led by Harvard psychologist Dr. Walter Langer, painted a disturbing portrait. A sociopath obsessed with control, driven by humiliation, and armored with delusion. They predicted he would never surrender, that he would choose suicide over capture. They were right. But they also suggested something more chilling, that Hitler's rise was not purely a product of madness, but of opportunity. He knew how to read fear. He understood the need people had for meaning, for unity, for revenge. And he gave it to them, not as hope, but as poison. After the war, further analysis of his inner circle revealed the scope of that poison. Albert Speer, the architect of Hitler's war economy, later admitted that the Führer rarely spoke of love or empathy, only of betrayal, legacy, purity, and destiny. His conversations were loops of grievance and prophecy, and in those final days in the bunker, those loops only tightened. Hitler spoke of betrayal by his generals, of ungrateful German civilians, of cowardice in the Wehrmacht. Even as the Red Army approached, he ranted about Jews, the press, and imagined conspiracies. There was no reflection, no remorse. no comprehension of the carnage. The man who had declared himself the savior of Germany died believing Germany didn't deserve him. That delusion that he was a misunderstood visionary was what sustained him even as everything collapsed. Those closest to him, like Eva Braun, had long stopped challenging it. Her presence in the bunker was not that of a lover with hope, but of a loyalist willing to vanish beside him. She had married him just 36 hours before their suicide, not in celebration, but in ritual. It was the last piece of theater he needed, the appearance of control, of dignity, of sacrifice. But there was nothing noble about their end. Their last act, biting cyanide, pulling a trigger, burning the corpses, was an erasure, a final refusal to be held accountable. The walls of the bunker still bore the scarring of his voice, and yet those walls said nothing. After the war, when Soviet teams recovered the structure, they stripped it, studied it, sealed it. Eventually, it was buried, and the world was left to piece together the fragments. For years, the only detailed accounts of Hitler's final days came from his surviving aides, men and women like Heinz Linge, his valet, Otto Günsche, his personal adjutant, and the secretaries who had typed until the very end. Their recollections were chilling not for their horror, but for their banality. Hitler complained about his dog, Blondie, being agitated. He asked for updates on fuel reserves that no longer mattered. He ate his final meals with routine precision: vegetarian stew, tea, biscuits. He gave medals to teenage soldiers, barely able to stand, who had come to the bunker to defend the ruins of Berlin. And then he died, not in war, not in confrontation, but in a locked room beside a woman who had never spoken publicly and whose body, like his, was turned to smoke. The tragedy is not just that it ended this way, it's that it had to. Because for a man so consumed by control, the only ending he could imagine was one where he remained the author. He could not allow a courtroom. He could not face cameras or handcuffs or the sound of a judge reading his crimes. He feared the humiliation more than the death. He feared becoming human. So he wrote his final scene, locked the door, and vanished into legend. But what he left behind was not mystery. It was a mirror. The reason we still talk about his final hour, the reason we return to the bunker, the bones, the bullet, is not because we miss him. It's because we see the reflection. The bunker wasn't just a physical space. It was the endpoint of a psychological arc, from messianic promise to apocalyptic collapse. And inside that arc are lessons we still haven't fully absorbed. That power unchecked becomes delusion. That ideology left unchallenged becomes machinery. That fear, when weaponized, can turn ordinary people into accomplices. And that even the most monstrous man can die quietly, leaving behind the chaos of choices we made long before his final breath. The real mystery isn't how Hitler died. It's how he lived for so long in the hearts of those who followed him, and how, even today, some still whisper his name, not with hatred, but with hunger. That is the bunker's true echo, not the shot, but the silence that followed. The silence that followed Hitler's death was not peaceful. It was heavy, trembling, as if history itself had paused mid-sentence, uncertain how to continue. The war had not ended. Not yet. Outside the bunker, Berlin continued to collapse one building at a time. Shells fell in erratic intervals. Smoke twisted through church steeples and hospital roofs. The Red Army kept advancing, not because there was anything left to take, but because the taking had become the rhythm of survival. In the Führerbunker, his inner circle waited in stunned detachment. Some wept, some sat still, some packed bags. The Führer was gone, the spell had broken, and for the first time in 12 years, the room was not governed by one voice. There was a quiet but terrifying question now filling the void. Who decides what happens next? That question would linger long after the war, haunting tribunals and textbooks alike. Because when a dictatorship ends with a gunshot instead of a trial, the responsibility becomes collective. No last testimony, no final orders, just fragments, and a vacuum. It was Joseph Goebbels who attempted to claim what was left. He declared himself the new Chancellor of Germany, not because he had a plan, but because power abhors a vacuum. He moved his 6 children into the bunker with his wife Magda. Photographs from those final days show them in clean clothes, holding books, smiling faintly, as if trying to insulate the children from the collapse of the Reich with routines and lullabies. But the illusion wouldn't last. Goebbels knew what was coming. The Soviets were less than 100 meters away. His options were fantasy. He couldn't surrender. He had spent too many years shaping Hitler's myth to survive outside it. Escape was impossible. And so he followed the logic of the bunker to its inevitable conclusion. On May 1st, one day after Hitler's death, Goebbels and Magda sedated their children with morphine. One by one, the 6 were laid gently on their beds in the narrow bunker room, then given cyanide, crushed in their jaws by Magda's hand. It was not rage, it was belief. A mother who had convinced herself that a world without National Socialism was not worth living in, not for her, and not for her children. That night, she and Goebbels walked into the garden above the bunker, where SS officers waited. He bit down on cyanide, she did the same. The soldiers then shot the bodies, soaked them in gasoline, and burned them, just as they had with Hitler and Brune. The garden of the Reich Chancellery, once the site of grand state ceremonies, was now a place of smoldering corpses and gasoline-stained earth. And still, the city burned. The day after, the Soviets fully secured the area. They entered the bunker not with caution, but with confusion. What they found did not resemble a command center of a dying empire. It resembled a tomb. Rooms still smelled of stale cigarette smoke. Half-eaten food remained on plates. Maps were pinned to walls with arrows pointing to armies that no longer existed. Hitler's personal library remained untouched, filled with history books, military theory, and nationalist philosophy. The leader of a war that killed millions had died surrounded not by generals, but by echoes. His dog dead, his body charred, his empire atomized, and yet the bunker radiated power. Not because of what happened there, but because of what the world imagined had happened. It became a physical symbol of how power ends, not in light, but in dark, subterranean quiet. As the Soviets sealed the bunker, interrogated the survivors, and buried the dead in secret locations, Western leaders tried to piece together a narrative. But the pieces never quite fit. Stalin refused to share details. Some survivors gave conflicting statements, and the lack of a confirmed body only fanned the fire. For ordinary Germans, the rumors offered a distraction from rubble and ration lines. If Hitler had escaped, it meant there was something unfinished, something that could be chased, punished, corrected. But he hadn't escaped, and that was the horror. The architect of ruin had taken the coward's exit, denying the world even the satisfaction of a trial. It was not justice, it was abandonment. In Nuremberg, as former Nazi officials stood trial, a haunting absence hovered above the proceedings. Hitler's seat was empty, his name spoken but never answered. Prosecutors displayed photographs of camps, charts of massacres, orders signed in his name, but his voice would never be heard again, only echoes, and in that echo was something more dangerous than memory. It was legacy, because the Reich had not died with him. Its fingerprints remained, in ideology, in language, in politics, not just in Germany, but in the countries that had fought against it. The symbols were banned, the words outlawed, but the ideas, nationalism, racial hierarchy, conspiracy, obedience, they never vanished. They evolved, went underground, rebranded. History books taught that Hitler's reign ended in 1945, but the psychology he mastered, the weaponization of grievance, was never buried. It resurfaced in new places, in new faces, and still we look to the bunker. Still we ask, how did it end? As if that answer will solve what came before it. But the truth is this, the bunker didn't explain Hitler, it mirrored him. Small, cramped, claustrophobic, obsessed with control. No windows, no light, just cement, steel, paranoia. It was the physical embodiment of his mind in the end, locked in, spiraling, waiting for collapse, and collapse did come. But not as thunder, as silence, as 6 children asleep forever in a narrow room, as 2 bodies burning above ground while soldiers smoked nearby, as secretaries staring at walls, wondering what they'd done, as Berlin fell block by block, not to ideology, but to exhaustion. That was the last hour of the Reich. Not a battle, not a broadcast, but a descent into madness, denial, and self-erasure. And the world has never stopped searching that darkness, hoping to find meaning in the ash. Long after the fires died out and the concrete walls were buried beneath post-war rubble, the image of the bunker endured. It became a fixation, not just for historians or survivors, but for the human mind itself, because something about that final hour refused to fade. We need our villains to answer for their crimes. We crave confession, courtroom testimony, the slow unfurling of guilt. But Hitler gave us none of that. He left a narrative with a hole in it, a vacuum, and that vacuum pulled everything into it. Rumors, fears, obsessions, half-truths. It wasn't just conspiracy theorists who couldn't let go. It was entire governments, journalists, filmmakers, authors. And underneath all of it, a question no tribunal could satisfy. How could one man, one body, one mind carry such devastation with him into silence? That's why the world kept digging, literally and figuratively. In the 1950s and 60s, Soviet operatives conducted multiple secret exhumations of the site where Hitler and Braun were believed to be buried. Their remains, along with those of Goebbels and his children, were dug up, reburied, incinerated again, and their ashes scattered. Stalin had ordered that no trace of Hitler should exist, no burial site, no place for worship or pilgrimage. And yet, this obsessive need to erase him only fed the myth. It gave rise to whispers that they hadn't found the body at all, that the man who orchestrated the Holocaust had simply walked out into the night, masked by chaos. The evidence was always there. Jawbone fragments, dental records, multiple eyewitness accounts. But psychologically, it wasn't enough. Because what we wanted wasn't a tooth. We wanted an ending, a satisfying one. But war rarely gives us those, and certainly not this war. So we created our own. Novels, movies, hidden files, old black and white photos discovered in attics all fueled the obsession. Hitler in Patagonia, the Fourth Reich, the escape plan. The narrative mutated, bloated, lost the contours of fact. And in that inflation of myth, the truth risked disappearing. The truth, after all, is quiet. It's not cinematic, it's not thrilling. It's a man in a dim room, shivering, hands trembling from a degenerative illness, barking orders no one will follow, reading reports that lie to him, surrounded by the stench of rotting ambition. It's the final chapter not of a godlike tyrant, but of a paranoid old man afraid of humiliation. But that truth doesn't sell tickets. So the world kept asking what really happened in that bunker. Did Eva Braun die willingly? Were there secret tunnels no one discovered? Were there doubles used, bodies switched, planes waiting nearby? Every theory said more about the people telling it than about Hitler himself. Because the hardest thing to admit is that he died exactly how we didn't want him to, free from justice. It wasn't supposed to end with suicide. It was supposed to end with judgment. That's why the post-war world clung to Nuremberg so tightly. Because without Hitler's trial, we needed a stage where the other monsters could answer. And they did, to varying degrees. Göring stole his own ending with cyanide, denying the gallows. Hess remained silent for decades. Others wept, some confessed, some deflected. But all of them existed in the shadow of one man who never faced the world. And in that void, new dangers began to grow. Because if you don't bury the truth clearly, it returns, not as history, but as ideology. Neo-Nazism didn't begin in Germany. It began in Argentina, in rural towns where ex-SS men told their children they were heroes. It began in pamphlets and newsletters passed through post-war networks. It began in the failure to give Hitler a public final defeat. Because justice requires visibility, and his death, no matter how real, was hidden, muffled, processed in secret. That secrecy allowed others to rewrite him, not in mainstream memory but in fringe movements, extremist circles, political undergrounds. They claimed he wasn't evil, just misunderstood. That the world had lied, that the Holocaust had been exaggerated. And once that door was opened, history began to split. In classrooms, we taught that fascism was defeated. But outside, in the corners of the internet and behind locked doors, a new myth was growing of power, purity, revenge. Hitler was no longer a person. He was a template. That is the consequence of letting tyrants write their final scene. Because Hitler, in choosing suicide, denied the world closure. He made himself legend, untouchable, ambiguous. His last act was not one of defeat. It was control, even in death, especially in death. And it worked. Ask 1,000 people how Hitler died, and most won't know the details. Many will say, "We're not sure." Others will say, "He escaped." And very few will say this: he died like a coward in a concrete box, chewing on cyanide, terrified of capture, surrounded by enablers who let him destroy everything. That's the truth. That's the real ending. But it's not the one we wanted. So we keep digging. We keep asking. Not because we don't know, but because we don't like what we know. We don't like what we know because it's too ordinary. Because when we peel back the propaganda, the speeches, the architecture of fear, what we find at the core of Hitler's death is not grandeur or horror. It's banality. A pale man pacing inside a crumbling bunker, a pistole, a capsule, silence. He died like many men do, quietly, inwardly, without spectacle. But what he carried with him into that silence was not just the legacy of a war or a nation. It was the moral weight of every ruined life he touched. And yet, the physical space that surrounded him in those final moments was shockingly small. The Führerbunker, for all its historical infamy, was cramped, poorly ventilated, echoing with the sounds of dripping water and distant artillery. It smelled of damp clothing, sweat, tobacco, cheap food, and fear. The rooms were lit by weak electric bulbs that buzzed and flickered. The walls, painted in dull greens and browns, bore stains from coal dust and water seepage. There was no natural light, no windows, just concrete, doors locked from the inside. And yet it was in this suffocating tomb that the final chapter of the Nazi regime unfolded. Hitler had retreated there in January 1945, long before the Soviets reached Berlin. He had chosen the bunker not as a last refuge, but as a final throne. From this dark cavern, he would deliver delusions, issue impossible commands, and await the apocalyptic finale he believed the German people deserved. He spoke openly of the need for total collapse, that if the German race could not win, it deserved extinction, and so, as his empire crumbled, he orchestrated his own descent. He refused to evacuate, refused to surrender, refused to face the world outside. Every morning his aides would bring him false military reports, maps with imaginary divisions, reports of counterattacks that didn't exist, suggestions that Wenck's army was on its way to relieve Berlin. Hitler clung to these fantasies not because he believed them, but because they gave him structure. The illusion of control. He would study the maps, mumble tactical nonsense, scold his officers for cowardice, and then retreat to his private quarters to shuffle papers no one would read. He didn't ask about the starving civilians above ground. He didn't send messages to the outside world. He focused only on the interior, the bunker, the loyalists, the shrinking circle of believers. And even that circle was breaking. Himmler had tried to negotiate with the Allies. Göring had sent a telegram suggesting he take control. Both betrayals shattered Hitler's last illusions of loyalty. He raged, ordered arrests, stripped titles. But the reality was this: everyone knew it was over. The only question was when and how. The people in the bunker, the secretaries, the guards, the aides, began whispering about death, not if, but who and when. The SS officers drank more, the cooks stopped preparing full meals. The typists, including Traudl Junge and Gerda Christian, began writing their final testaments. Eva Braun put on her best clothes and refused to leave Hitler's side. She never showed fear, never complained. Whether she was brave or delusional, no one will ever know. But she made one thing clear: if Hitler died, she would die with him. And so, on April 29, 1945, with the walls shaking and the Soviets less than 500 meters away, Hitler married Eva in a brief ceremony witnessed by his inner circle. The mood was surreal. Champagne was poured. Toasts were made. The newlyweds posed for photographs, their faces hollow, their eyes vacant. It was not a wedding. It was a prelude. The next morning, Hitler called in his valet, Heinz Linge, and his adjutant Otto Günsche, and gave them final instructions. His body was to be burned immediately after death. He would not allow the Soviets to find him. He had seen what was done to Mussolini. He would not be displayed. He would vanish on his own terms. Then he withdrew with Eva into his private room. A few moments later, a gunshot, just one. When Gunsche and Linge entered, they found Hitler slumped on the couch, blood dripping from his temple, the pistol still in his hand. Eva had taken cyanide. Her body lay beside him, lifeless. The two bodies were wrapped in blankets, carried upstairs to the garden, doused with gasoline, and set alight. The flame rose, but the silence remained. No speech, no declaration, just smoke curling into a sky filled with ash. Inside the bunker, no one celebrated. There were no cheers, no vows of vengeance, just resignation. The spell had broken. The man they had followed into hell was gone, and all that remained was a question none of them could answer. What now? For decades, historians have combed through these final hours, studying every word, every move, every whisper. But the truth is that history cannot satisfy the hunger we feel when a villain dies unseen. We want spectacle. We want closure. But all we got was cement, blood, and a fire in a ruined garden. That is the unbearable truth of Hitler's final hour. It ended not with a bang, but with a silence the world has never stopped trying to explain. In the days that followed the silence, the bunker transformed from a secret command center into a tomb, not just of people, but of illusions. The Nazi regime had promised a 1,000-year empire, a purified society, a rebirth of German pride. It ended not in triumph or glory, but in a concrete basement where the most powerful man in Europe burned his body beside a woman he barely acknowledged in public life. Above ground, Berlin was unrecognizable. Entire blocks were reduced to gray rubble. Children wandered without parents. Hospitals operated without power. Rats picked through bread lines. And the sound that defined those days was not speeches or marching boots, but the slow, deliberate thud of Soviet artillery and the collapsing of walls. The Red Army finally took full control of Berlin on May 2, 1945, 5 days after Hitler's death. But by then, there was no one left to surrender. The German high command was fractured, orders conflicted, communications severed. Some units fought to the last bullet, others deserted in droves. The Reich, as it had existed, ceased to be not with an official signature, but with a collective crumbling of will. And so the bunker was left behind, partially flooded, filled with empty files, blood-stained carpets, and bullet-pocked ceilings. The Soviets were the first to explore it fully. They found everything and nothing: uniforms hanging on doors, food half-eaten on plates, telephones with dead lines. In one room, Hitler's last map lay untouched, arrows drawn with red pencil still pointing to phantom divisions. The official Soviet reports were contradictory. Stalin himself was obsessed with Hitler's death. He didn't believe the reports. He questioned his generals, demanded autopsies, asked again and again, "Are we sure?" There was no body intact, only dental remains, scorched bone fragments, some fabric, a blood-stained couch. Stalin instructed his security chief, Lavrentiy Beria, to suppress details. The world wasn't to know, not yet. And so a silence fell, this time not from death but from power. The Soviets released almost nothing. The West speculated wildly, and conspiracy took root like fungus in the dark. In the United States and Britain, newspapers printed rumors of Hitler sightings in Argentina, Spain, even Tibet. A man who had sent millions to their deaths had become, in his own death, a ghost. The CIA opened files. Mossad chased leads. Journalists flew to South America. But none of it could answer the most basic question. If Hitler was dead, why was his presence still so alive in the world's imagination? The answer lies in what he left behind. Not a government, not an army, but a blueprint. The infrastructure of Nazism didn't dissolve with his death. It scattered, and some of it found new soil. Thousands of former Nazis escaped justice by fleeing to other countries, not just South America, but Canada, the United States, and the Middle East. They were engineers, scientists, doctors, men like Wernher von Braun, who helped build the V-2 rockets that terrorized London, was quietly absorbed into America's space program. Operation Paperclip, the US government's secret project to recruit Nazi scientists, brought over hundreds of such men in the name of Cold War advantage. Their pasts were scrubbed. Their expertise was too valuable. And so, while Hitler lay in ash, parts of his war machine were reborn under different flags. In South America, entire communities were built by ex-Nazis, Bariloche in Argentina, the colonies in Paraguay and Chile. There, former SS officers lived under false names, opened businesses, raised children. Some taught their ideology to the next generation. Others buried it deep under layers of guilt and survival. But the seed had already been planted. Hitler's death may have ended the Third Reich, but it did not kill the ideas, because those ideas were not stored in one man. They were disseminated through speeches, school books, laws, fear, and after the war, when those systems were dismantled, the residue remained. Not as government policy, but as belief. The belief that strength comes from dominance, that purity is preferable to diversity, that control is better than freedom. These ideas, once unleashed, do not die with a bullet. They adapt, they wait, and in every era since, we have seen pieces of them re-emerge. That's why the bunker still matters, not because of who died in it, but because of what survived it. Hitler's physical end was mundane, but his ideological afterlife is not. Neo-Nazi movements in Europe, white supremacist groups in the United States, ethno-nationalist parties gaining traction across the globe, they all pull from the same shadow. And that shadow is darkest where truth is hidden. That is the tragedy of those final hours. The world was denied a public reckoning, a trial, a sentencing. Instead, we were left with ash and rumor. The Holocaust had no last witness in the courtroom of its architect. Hitler spoke no final words to history. He simply vanished. And into that vacuum, generations have poured their fears, their fantasies, their lies. But the bunker tells a different story, a simpler one. A man, surrounded by the collapse of everything he built, chose death over consequence. Not because he was strong, but because he was weak. The myth of his power dies when you stand inside the room where he ended it all. It's not grand. It's not cinematic. It's a concrete cube, slightly damp, eerily quiet. And that silence. That is the sound of delusion running out of space. The silence of that bunker, that cold, still air left behind by a man who once demanded thunder, did not stay contained beneath Berlin's ruins. It spread, not through gunfire or marching boots, but through memory, absence, and the quiet fear that such a thing could happen again. The Allies buried the site, covered it in gravel, in apartment blocks, in denial. For years, maps labeled the location as no longer existing, as if by erasing coordinates we could erase consequence. But the world didn't forget, because history doesn't live in maps. It lives in repetition. The fall of the Nazi regime was supposed to be a warning etched into the foundation of the modern world. But over time, the meaning began to blur. The image of Hitler, once taboo, returned in satire, in cartoons, in internet jokes. Each parody diluted the horror, made him smaller, less human, less real. And then something stranger happened. People began to ask if maybe he hadn't been that bad, if maybe the facts had been exaggerated, if maybe the books had lied. It began in whispers, denial of the Holocaust, revisionist history, questions posed not in pursuit of truth, but in pursuit of absolution. And in those whispers, the ghost of the bunker stirred. Because what died with Hitler's body did not include his legacy. That survived. In systems, in symbols, in how the world rebuilt itself. Germany became democratic, yes. But former Nazis sat in courtrooms, in banks, in government offices well into the 1950s. Some helped write laws, others just quietly disappeared into bureaucracy. And elsewhere, far from the ruins of Europe, those ideas found new costumes. In America, segregationists studied Nazi race laws. In South Africa, apartheid architects read Mein Kampf. In Eastern Europe, authoritarian leaders rebranded fascism as national pride. Hitler's body had burned, but the architecture of his ideology was too useful, too adaptable, too familiar. The idea that fear is strength, that enemies must be manufactured, that unity can be built from exclusion. These were not new ideas in 1945, and they did not vanish in 1945. They just changed language, changed borders. In the decades that followed, the world entered a Cold War, a war of ideologies. And while the battle lines were drawn between capitalism and communism, the deeper fight, the fight over truth, memory, and identity, was shaped by what Hitler left behind. Propaganda was no longer just about posters and speeches. It became television, textbooks, entire narratives. And while the world never again allowed a man like Hitler to rise exactly as he had, the lessons of his rise and his cowardly exit were often forgotten. Because it's easier to remember Hitler as a monster than as a warning. Monsters are otherworldly. They exist outside us. They are aberrations. But Hitler was not an aberration. He was a man who convinced millions to follow him into catastrophe, using fear, frustration, humiliation, and lies. He understood the psyche of a broken nation. He offered revenge, and then he delivered ruin. That is what people fear when they look at the bunker. Not the death of one man, but the memory of how close the world came to collapsing under its own despair. The bunker is not just a physical space. It's a metaphor for what happens when we retreat from truth, when we build echo chambers, when we surround ourselves with enablers and silence the dissenters. It is what happens when institutions bend to charisma, when fear replaces fact, when people choose comfort over confrontation. The final hours of the Third Reich were not marked by defiant speeches or martyrdom. They were marked by collapse, by denial, by quiet executions of children who had no say in their parents' choices, by burned bodies and whispered regrets. And yet, even today, the myths persist. Because part of us wants to believe that evil is theatrical, obvious, dressed in black, shouting on stages. But real evil, the kind that changes nations, is quieter. It whispers, it flatters, it promises safety, and it walks calmly into bunkers, holding hands with apathy. That's why we still search for meaning in Hitler's final hour, because deep down, we fear the silence more than the scream. The scream is clear, it's undeniable. But the silence, the slow, willful silence of people who knew better and said nothing, that is what makes history repeat. Today, the Führer bunker is a parking lot. A signpost nearby tells the story in a few paragraphs. Tourists take selfies, locals walk past. And yet underneath that ground, in that soil, is the echo of a choice made by one man to avoid justice, a choice made by millions to follow him, and choices yet to be made by us. Because the last hour in that bunker did not end with the end of a life. It ended with the beginning of a question. What do we do with the memory of a tyrant who left no final words? Do we bury him deeper? Or do we keep his ending visible, raw, and unresolved, not for fascination, but for warning? Because history is not a circle, it's a mirror. And sometimes, when the light is low, and the rhetoric is loud, and the world feels too uncertain to trust, we look into that mirror and see familiar shapes returning. The same instincts, the same fears, the same hunger for strong men and simple answers. And when that happens, we would do well to remember that the last hour in Hitler's bunker was not a triumph of strength. It was the end of a man who couldn't face the consequences of his own cruelty. He didn't go out fighting. He didn't go out noble. He vanished, cowardly, silent, and alone. That is not power. That is fear. And fear, if not faced, will always find another bunker. The final truth of Hitler's bunker is not just historical, it's psychological. Because what died underground in Berlin wasn't only a man or a regime. What died was the illusion of invincibility, that evil always announces itself with a bang, that we'll recognize it when it comes, that tyrants will face justice before the curtain falls. But they don't always. Sometimes they vanish in a locked room while the world burns above them. And sometimes, even after the door is sealed, their presence leaks through the cracks in our culture, our memory, our fear. The post-war world was built on the rubble of those hours. We drew lines, built institutions, wrote laws. We said, "Never again," with trembling hands. The United Nations was born. Nuremberg gave us crimes against humanity. Germany rebuilt itself with shame carved into stone. But underneath all this architecture, beneath the treaties, the declarations, the memorials, was a question we never fully answered. What do we do when evil ends quietly? When it escapes its own consequences? When it takes the easy exit while leaving the rest of us to carry the wreckage? We've never answered that. Not fully. And so we return to the bunker. Not to glorify it, not to study its walls, but to wrestle with the fact that the world's most infamous tyrant died the same way many men die, afraid, isolated, and clinging to control. He gave no final speech, left no confession, and in that silence, he denied us something we didn't realize we needed: closure, a reckoning, a last word. But maybe that's the point. Maybe there are no last words when it comes to someone like Hitler. Maybe there shouldn't be. Because the desire to finish the story, to put a neat bow on it, is exactly what allows history to slip back into myth. We don't need a clean ending. We need a warning that never stops echoing. That bunker, buried beneath a city rebuilt in glass and concrete, is still there. Its physical walls may have collapsed, but the psychological space remains. A reminder of what power does when it's unchecked, when it retreats from accountability, when it weaponizes grievance into ideology. It's easy to point at 1945 and say, "That was then." But look around, listen. The rhetoric returns. The strong men rise. The lines between fact and propaganda blur. Fear creeps into public discourse dressed as patriotism. Authoritarianism wears the language of law and order, and people cheer. Not because they're evil, but because they're tired or afraid or desperate for someone to say, "I can fix this." That's how it begins. That's how it always begins. And if we forget the silence of that bunker, if we romanticize it, meme it, reduce it to trivia, we miss the cost. Because the cost wasn't paid by Hitler. It was paid by the millions who died screaming while he hid underground. It was paid by the families torn apart, the cultures erased, the futures stolen, and it was paid by every generation since, trying to untangle how so much darkness was concentrated into one era, one ideology, one man. The truth is, it wasn't just one man. It never is. It's systems, complicity, silence. That's what built the bunker. Not bricks, not steel, but obedience. Bureaucracy, people doing their jobs, people saying, "It's not my problem," people looking away. And in the end, when the monster they built turned the gun on himself, they were left with the ruins. Not glory, not victory, just ash. The bunker is a cautionary tale told in whispers. Not about war, but about the moments before it. The votes, the speeches, the scapegoats, the apathy, the jokes that stopped being jokes. That is the real last hour of Hitler, not 60 Minutes in April 1945, but the slow, suffocating drift toward surrendering morality in exchange for belonging. That hour stretches across time, and it's still ticking. Every time we ignore injustice, every time we let power speak louder than truth, every time we choose comfort over conscience, the hour begins again. That's why this story matters. Not because it's about Hitler, but because it's about us, about what we allow, about what we deny, about what we choose to remember, and what we choose to forget. And so, if there is any lesson to carry from that final bunker, from that concrete chamber buried under a dying regime, it is this: silence is not neutral, and forgetting is not healing. We don't need to mythologize that bunker. We need to remember it exactly as it was, a tomb built by delusion, lit by cowardice, and sealed by fear. And then we need to look around and ask ourselves the only question that matters now. Will we see it coming next time?